Maria Thompson moved through the marble hallways of Sterling Industries like a ghost in the early morning darkness, her keys jingling softly as she unlocked door after door on the 42nd floor. At 45 years old, she had mastered the art of being invisible, slipping in and out of offices while the city still slept, leaving behind spotless spaces for people who rarely noticed her existence. Her uniform was always pressed, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her movements efficient and quiet, as she went about her work with the kind of dignity that comes from taking pride in honest labor, even when others looked right through her. The executive floor was her domain from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. every weekday, and in 12 years of cleaning these offices, she had become an unwitting witness to the private lives of some of the city's most powerful people. She knew which executives kept bottles of expensive whiskey hidden in their desk drawers, which ones cried quietly during late-night phone calls with their spouses, and which ones popped pills when they thought no one was watching. But it was Richard Sterling, the 52-year-old CEO, who had caught her attention in recent months, not because of his commanding presence during board meetings or his reputation for closing million-dollar deals, but because of the small, troubling details that everyone else seemed to miss. While his assistants saw only his perfectly tailored suits and confident stride, Maria noticed how his left hand trembled slightly when he signed documents, how he would pause and lean against his desk when he thought no one was looking, and how his once robust frame was gradually becoming thinner, despite his expensive clothes being altered to hide the weight loss. She had been cleaning around him during meetings where he commanded rooms full of executives with his sharp intellect and decisive manner, but she also saw him alone in his office afterward, clutching his stomach and taking deep, careful breaths, as if fighting off waves of pain. The prescription bottles were another red flag. Maria had caught glimpses of them when she emptied his trash or dusted his desk, always quickly shoved into drawers when footsteps approached in the hallway. Her mother had been diabetic, and Maria had spent years learning to recognize the subtle signs of serious illness that doctors sometimes missed in their rush to treat obvious symptoms. The untouched lunches were perhaps the most telling sign of all. Expensive meals from the city's finest restaurants would sit on Richard's desk for hours, barely touched, before being thrown away, and Maria began to notice that he only picked at crackers and sipped ginger ale when he thought he was alone. Her heart ached as she watched this powerful man slowly deteriorating, while everyone around him attributed his occasional absences and decreased appetite to the stress of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. On Tuesday morning, as Maria was emptying the wastebasket beside Richard's massive oak desk, she found several tissues spotted with bright red blood, and her stomach dropped with the kind of dread that comes from recognizing a sign that cannot be ignored. She had seen her mother cough up blood in the months before her diagnosis, and the memory sent a chill through her entire body as she stared at the evidence that Richard Sterling was in serious trouble. The corporate world continued to spin around them, with assistants scheduling meetings and executives discussing quarterly reports. But Maria felt like she was watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, while everyone else remained blissfully unaware. She thought about her 3 children, all grown now, but still calling her for advice, and wondered what they would think if they knew their mother was considering speaking up about the health of a man who barely acknowledged her existence. The class divide between them was enormous. He lived in a penthouse apartment and owned vacation homes in 3 countries, while she rented a small apartment and took the bus to work every morning. But illness didn't care about bank accounts or social status. That evening, as Maria was finishing her rounds and preparing to leave for her second job at the grocery store, she heard raised voices coming from Richard's office and saw through the glass walls that he was in a heated discussion with his vice president about a merger that could make or break the company. She watched as Richard suddenly went pale, his hand flying to his chest, and she saw him sway slightly before gripping the edge of his desk to steady himself. The vice president seemed oblivious, continuing to wave papers and point at charts, while Richard nodded weakly and tried to maintain his composure. Maria felt a powerful urge to burst into the room and demand that someone call a doctor. But she knew that overstepping her boundaries could cost her the job that supported her family. Instead, she lingered in the hallway, cleaning the same section of marble floor 3 times while keeping an eye on the office, ready to call for help if Richard collapsed. The meeting ended with handshakes and fake smiles. But as soon as the vice president left, Maria saw Richard sink into his leather chair and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with exhaustion or pain. She made a decision that terrified her. Tomorrow, she would find a way to speak to him directly, consequences be damned, because watching someone slowly die while staying silent was not something she could live with. As she gathered her cleaning supplies and headed for the elevator, Maria whispered a prayer for courage and wisdom, knowing that tomorrow would change everything for both of them. The next morning arrived with the shocking news that Richard Sterling had collapsed during a late evening meeting and been rushed to the hospital, confirming Maria's worst fears and setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter both their lives. The morning after Richard Sterling's collapse, Maria Thompson arrived at Sterling Industries to find the entire 42nd floor buzzing with whispered conversations and worried glances, as employees huddled around coffee machines and water coolers discussing their CEO's sudden hospitalization in hushed tones that carried a mixture of genuine concern and curious gossip. The official statement released by the company's public relations team spoke of exhaustion and stress-related issues, describing Richard's collapse as a wake-up call for an overworked executive who simply needed rest and medical attention. But Maria knew the truth was far more serious than anyone wanted to admit. As she pushed her cleaning cart through the marble corridors, she overheard fragments of conversations that made her stomach churn with frustration. Junior executives speculating that their boss had been partying too hard, senior managers joking about the pressures of being at the top, and board members dismissing the incident as typical behavior for high-achieving workaholics who burned themselves out chasing success. Nobody seemed to grasp the gravity of what Maria had witnessed over the past months, and she felt like screaming at these well-dressed, educated people who were so blind to the obvious signs of serious illness that had been right in front of them. The executive conference room became her most dreaded stop each morning, because that's where the board members gathered to discuss Richard's condition and the company's future, speaking in the casual tones of people who had never watched a loved one fade away from a mysterious illness. She scrubbed the mahogany table while listening to comments that made her blood boil. Wealthy men in expensive suits suggesting that Richard just needed a vacation in Europe or a few weeks at a spa, completely oblivious to the medical emergency that was unfolding before their eyes. Maria's hands trembled as she polished the same spot over and over, remembering how her own mother had been dismissed by doctors who attributed her symptoms to menopause and stress, until it was almost too late to save her life. The weight of her knowledge pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe as she went through the motions of her daily routine while carrying the burden of information that could potentially save Richard's life. Her evening shift at the grocery store became a refuge where she could lose herself in the simple task of stocking shelves. But even there her mind wandered back to the bloodied tissues and the way Richard had gripped his desk to keep from falling. Her youngest daughter Carmen called that Wednesday night, excited about her pre-med studies and full of stories about her anatomy classes, and Maria found herself describing Richard's symptoms in careful, general terms, asking hypothetical questions about what such signs might indicate. Carmen's voice grew serious as she listened, and when Maria finished speaking, her daughter said quietly that those symptoms sounded like something that required immediate and aggressive medical intervention, not rest and relaxation. The validation from someone she trusted gave Maria the courage she needed, but it also intensified her sense of urgency as she realized that every day of delay could mean the difference between life and death for a man she barely knew but couldn't stop caring about. When Richard returned to work 3 days later, Maria's heart sank at the sight of him. His skin had a grayish pallor that makeup couldn't hide. His clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his famous confident stride had been replaced by careful, measured steps that spoke of someone fighting to maintain appearances while battling internal demons. He smiled and waved at employees who welcomed him back, but Maria saw through the performance to the exhaustion in his eyes and the way he leaned heavily against walls when he thought nobody was watching. The charade was painful to witness, like watching someone drowning while pretending to swim, and Maria knew that the medical evaluation he had received was either incomplete or being ignored by a man too proud to admit vulnerability. That Thursday evening, as Maria finished cleaning the reception area and prepared to catch her bus home, she made a decision that terrified her more than anything she had ever done. She would speak directly to Richard Sterling about what she had observed, regardless of the consequences to her job or her family's financial security. She had raised 3 children as a single mother, worked 2 jobs for 15 years to put food on the table, and survived challenges that would have broken weaker people. But the thought of confronting a powerful CEO about his personal health made her palms sweat and her heart race. The plan formed slowly in her mind as she rode the bus home through the city's evening traffic. She would wait until Friday after everyone else had gone home, then knock on his office door and speak her truth with the same courage that had carried her through every other impossible situation in her life. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that sometimes the people who see the truth most clearly are the ones standing on the outside looking in, and that speaking up for someone who cannot speak for themselves is both a privilege and a responsibility. Friday arrived with gray clouds and steady rain that seemed to mirror Maria's nervous energy as she went through her morning routine with unusual attention to detail, as if perfect cleaning could somehow give her the strength she would need for the conversation that lay ahead. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, and Maria found herself rehearsing what she would say while emptying trash cans and dusting furniture, practicing different approaches and trying to find words that would convey her concerns without sounding presumptuous or overstepping the invisible boundaries that separated their worlds. When 6 o'clock arrived and the last executive finally left the floor, Maria took a deep breath, smoothed her uniform, and walked slowly toward Richard's office, where lights still glowed behind the frosted glass doors, knowing that the next few minutes would either save a man's life or cost her everything she had worked so hard to build. Maria's knuckles barely made a sound against the heavy oak door, but Richard Sterling looked up from his computer screen with surprise and confusion, his tired eyes taking a moment to focus on the woman standing in his doorway, wearing a cleaning uniform and holding her hands clasped tightly in front of her. His initial reaction was one of mild irritation mixed with bewilderment, because in 12 years of working in this building, he could count on one hand the number of times any member of the cleaning staff had approached him directly, and certainly never in the evening when he was trying to catch up on the mountain of work that had piled up during his brief hospital stay. Maria felt her courage wavering under his intense gaze, but the memory of her mother's final days and the image of those bloodied tissues gave her strength as she cleared her throat and asked if she could speak with him for just a moment about something important. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly as he gestured toward the chair across from his desk, more out of curiosity than genuine interest, because he assumed she was going to complain about her work schedule or ask for a raise, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. Maria perched on the edge of the expensive leather chair and began speaking in a voice that trembled with nervousness but grew stronger with each word, describing the changes she had observed in his appearance and behavior over the past 6 months, with the careful attention of someone who had spent years watching for signs of illness in people she loved. She spoke about the untouched meals, the prescription bottles hastily hidden when people approached, the way he favored his left side when walking, and the gradual weight loss that his tailored clothing couldn't completely disguise, painting a picture of declining health that made Richard's face grow pale with recognition and embarrassment. The blood in the tissues was the detail that hit him like a physical blow, because he had thought his careful disposal of evidence had gone unnoticed, never imagining that the invisible cleaning lady was cataloging his symptoms with the precision of a trained medical professional. Maria's voice grew more confident as she described her mother's battle with pancreatic issues and how similar symptoms had been dismissed by doctors as stress-related problems until emergency surgery revealed the true extent of the disease, and she urged Richard to demand more comprehensive testing from his physicians rather than accepting their superficial explanations about executive burnout. Richard's face cycled through a range of emotions as Maria spoke, surprise giving way to embarrassment, then anger at her presumption, and finally a cold fury that someone of her social status would dare to question his personal medical care and the judgment of expensive specialists who had assured him that rest and stress management would solve his problems. When Maria finished speaking, the silence in the office felt heavy and dangerous, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of traffic 42 floors below. As Richard struggled to process the fact that his cleaning lady had just delivered a more accurate assessment of his condition than doctors who charged $500 for 15-minute consultations, his pride wounded and his privacy violated, Richard's response was swift and cutting, telling Maria in clipped, professional tones that he appreciated her concern but found it inappropriate for her to involve herself in his personal affairs, and suggesting that she focus on her cleaning duties rather than playing amateur diagnostician with her employer's health. The words hit Maria like physical blows, and she felt tears burning behind her eyes as she realized that her worst fears were coming true. He was going to dismiss her concerns just like everyone else had dismissed her mother's symptoms until it was almost too late. But Maria was not her mother's daughter for nothing, and she had not survived 15 years of single parenthood by giving up when things got difficult. So she reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper that she had prepared earlier, placing it gently on Richard's desk before standing to leave. The note contained information she had researched at the public library during her lunch breaks, including statistics about pancreatic cancer survival rates when caught early versus late-stage diagnosis, and phone numbers for specialist centers that focused on digestive diseases, written in her careful handwriting with the hope that knowledge might succeed where personal appeal had failed. Richard's eyes burned with humiliation and anger as he watched her leave, but something about her dignity in the face of his harsh rejection made him feel smaller than he had felt in years, and after she was gone, he found himself staring at the folded paper as if it were a poisonous snake that might bite him if he touched it. For the next 2 weeks, Richard threw himself into work with a vengeance that surprised even his most dedicated employees, attending every meeting, reviewing every report, and pushing his weakening body to its limits, as if superhuman effort could prove that Maria Thompson was wrong about his health. He flew to conferences in 3 different cities, negotiated to major deals, and maintained a schedule that would have challenged a healthy man half his age, all while ignoring the growing pain in his abdomen and the increasing frequency of episodes that left him dizzy and nauseous. But late at night, alone in his penthouse apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Richard would find himself thinking about Maria's words and the quiet authority with which she had described symptoms that matched his own experience with uncomfortable accuracy, and he would wonder if his expensive doctors had been telling him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The note remained folded on his desk, untouched but not thrown away. A constant reminder of a conversation he wished he could forget but couldn't stop thinking about, especially during the dark hours before dawn when pain kept him awake and he found himself Googling symptoms that sounded all too familiar. Meanwhile, Maria continued her work with a heavy heart, watching Richard push himself harder each day while growing visibly weaker, and she found herself praying every morning that she would not be the one to find him collapsed on his office floor when his body finally surrendered to whatever was eating him alive, from the inside out. The merger presentation was supposed to be Richard Sterling's moment of triumph, the deal that would cement his legacy as one of the most successful CEOs in the city's history. But as he stood before a room full of potential investors and board members, pointing at charts that blurred before his eyes, he felt his body betraying him in ways that no amount of willpower could overcome. The pain in his abdomen had grown from a dull ache to sharp, stabbing sensations that took his breath away, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned conference room, as he struggled to maintain his professional composure while his vision wavered and his hands shook uncontrollably. He had taken 3 different pain medications that morning, washing them down with coffee that tasted like acid in his empty stomach. But nothing could mask the reality that something catastrophic was happening inside his body. Something that demanded immediate attention, regardless of the millions of dollars riding on this presentation. The investors watched with growing concern as Richard's voice became weaker and his sentences more fragmented, their confident smiles fading into worried frowns as the man they had come to see as invincible began to crumble before their eyes. Richard's assistant, seated at the back of the room, felt her heart racing as she watched her boss lean heavily against the presentation screen, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost dressed in an expensive suit, and she found herself reaching for her phone to call for medical help even before he collapsed. The moment came without warning. 1 second Richard was describing projected quarterly earnings, and the next he was doubled over in agony, his hands clutching his stomach as a sound escaped his lips that was part groan and part desperate gasp for air, before his knees buckled and he crashed to the polished conference room floor in front of 20 stunned witnesses. The chaos that followed was a blur of shouting voices, someone calling 911, board members pushing back their chairs and crowding around Richard's motionless form, and his assistant barking orders at security while she tried to remember the first aid training she had taken years ago but never expected to use. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements in medical jargon creating an island of calm professionalism in the storm of corporate panic, and Richard drifted in and out of consciousness as they worked over him, catching fragments of medical terms that sounded ominous and urgent. The ambulance ride to the hospital passed in a haze of sirens and medical equipment, with Richard floating between awareness and darkness, while paramedics monitored his vital signs and radioed ahead to the emergency room, their voices carrying a gravity that cut through his pain-induced confusion and made him realize that this was not another stress-related incident that could be dismissed with rest and reassurance. The emergency room became a whirlwind of activity as doctors and nurses swarmed around his gurney, ordering blood tests, scans, and examinations, while Richard tried to answer their rapid-fire questions through waves of pain that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and concerned faces, until finally Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief oncologist, sat down beside Richard's bed with the kind of expression that medical professionals reserve for delivering life-changing news. Her words hit him like physical blows: advanced pancreatic cancer, likely present for months, possibly longer. Caught late because early symptoms had been dismissed as stress-related issues that could be managed with lifestyle changes and executive coaching. Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but unflinchingly direct as she explained that the blood work, scans, and physical examination all pointed to the same devastating conclusion, and that immediate, aggressive treatment would be necessary if there was any hope of survival. Richard listened with growing horror as the doctor described symptoms that matched perfectly with Maria Thompson's observations from weeks earlier: the weight loss, abdominal pain, changes in appetite, and yes, even the blood that he thought he had successfully hidden from everyone around him. The irony was crushing and inescapable. A cleaning lady with no medical training had diagnosed him more accurately than his personal physician, who had been content to prescribe antacids and suggest that Richard reduce his work hours to manage what he assumed was an ulcer brought on by executive stress. As the full weight of his situation settled over him like a heavy blanket, Richard found his mind returning again and again to that evening in his office when Maria had stood before his desk, her voice trembling with nervous energy but her words precise and caring, describing exactly the symptoms that were now threatening to kill him. The memory of his harsh dismissal of her concerns burned in his chest with shame that felt worse than the physical pain coursing through his body, because he realized that his wounded pride and social prejudices had nearly cost him his life. Dr. Chen continued, explaining treatment options and survival statistics. But Richard's attention kept drifting to thoughts of a woman he had barely acknowledged as a human being. Someone whose wisdom and compassion he had rejected because she wore a cleaning uniform instead of a medical degree. The folded note that Maria had left on his desk was still in his jacket pocket, retrieved by his assistant along with his other personal belongings, and when Richard asked a nurse to read it to him, he discovered detailed information about pancreatic cancer specialists and treatment centers that could have saved him weeks of valuable time if he had swallowed his pride and listened to someone who cared enough to speak up when everyone else remained silent. 6 months after the diagnosis that nearly killed him, Richard Sterling stood at the podium in Sterling Industries' main auditorium facing 800 employees who had gathered for the annual company meeting. But the man they saw before them bore little resemblance to the cold, distant CEO who had collapsed during that fateful merger presentation. The aggressive chemotherapy had taken its toll on his physical appearance. His once thick hair had grown back thinner and grayer. His expensive suits now hung more loosely on his smaller frame, and his face carried lines of experience that spoke of someone who had stared death in the face and emerged with a fundamentally different understanding of what truly mattered in life. But it was his eyes that showed the most dramatic change, because where there had once been the calculating gaze of a corporate predator, focused solely on profits and power, there now burned a warmth and humanity that made even the most junior employees feel seen and valued as individuals rather than mere cogs in a machine designed to generate wealth. Maria Thompson sat in the front row, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she watched the man whose life she had helped save, wearing not her old cleaning uniform but a professional business suit that marked her new position as Director of Employee Wellness, a role that Richard had created specifically for her after recognizing that her natural ability to notice and care for others made her uniquely qualified to ensure that no employee's health concerns would ever again be overlooked or dismissed. The transformation in Maria's own life had been equally dramatic. Gone were the pre-dawn shifts with her cleaning cart and the exhausting double schedule that had defined her existence for 15 years, replaced by an office on the executive floor and a salary that allowed her to move her family into a better neighborhood and finally pursue the nursing degree she had abandoned decades earlier when single motherhood demanded every moment of her time and energy. As Richard began to speak, his voice carrying none of the harsh authority that had once intimidated subordinates, but instead conveying the gentle strength of someone who had learned that true leadership comes from service rather than domination. Maria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she remembered the terrified woman who had knocked on his office door months earlier, convinced that speaking up would cost her everything she had worked so hard to build. Richard's words carried across the packed auditorium with the power of hard-won wisdom, as he told the assembled crowd that the company's greatest asset was not their cutting-edge technology or their dominant market position, but the people who made their success possible. Every single person, regardless of their title or position, or the color of their skin, or the language they spoke at home. His voice grew stronger as he described how the most important voices in any organization are often the ones that leadership is not trained to hear. The quiet observations of people who see everything but are rarely asked for their opinions, and how Maria Thompson had demonstrated the kind of courage that saves lives by speaking up when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent. The audience listened in stunned silence as Richard shared the story of his near-death experience, describing how a woman they had all seen pushing cleaning carts through their hallways had noticed symptoms that doctors, executives, and he himself had missed or dismissed, and how her willingness to risk her job by confronting a powerful CEO had literally saved his life and transformed his understanding of human worth and dignity. Maria felt her cheeks burning as hundreds of pairs of eyes turned toward her with expressions of amazement and respect, because she had never wanted recognition for doing what any caring person would do when faced with someone else's suffering. But she also understood that Richard was using their story to teach a larger lesson about seeing and valuing every human being regardless of their circumstances or social status. The applause that followed was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. A thunderous outpouring of appreciation that seemed to go on forever as employees throughout the auditorium rose to their feet in recognition of the quiet heroism that had unfolded in their workplace. And when the noise finally died down, Richard continued his speech by announcing sweeping changes to company policy that would ensure every employee had access to comprehensive health care and a voice in workplace wellness decisions. The new programs Richard described represented a complete revolution in corporate culture: regular health screenings for all employees, regardless of their position, mental health support services, flexible schedules for people dealing with family medical issues, and most importantly, a commitment to listening to concerns raised by any employee about any other employee's well-being, creating an environment where caring for one another became as important as meeting quarterly profit targets. As the meeting concluded and employees began filing out of the auditorium, many of them stopped to shake Maria's hand or share their own stories of times when they had noticed concerning changes in coworkers, but felt powerless to speak up. And she realized that her experience with Richard had given permission for an entire organization to embrace the radical idea that every person's life has value and deserves protection. Later that evening, as Maria walked through the same marble corridors where she had once moved invisibly with her cleaning supplies, she was greeted warmly by employees at every level who sought her advice, shared their concerns, and treated her not as the former cleaning lady who had gotten lucky, but as someone whose wisdom and compassion had earned their respect and gratitude. Her youngest daughter, Carmen, now in her final year of medical school, called that night to tell her mother that she had decided to specialize in oncology, inspired by the story of how paying attention to details that others missed could mean the difference between life and death. And Maria smiled as she realized that the courage to speak up for someone who could not speak for themselves was becoming a family legacy that would touch lives for generations to come.